Matt Campbell is the CEO and co-founder of Terabase, and I'm really glad you're here today, Matt. Thanks for joining me on 3-Minute Field Notes.
Thanks. Great to see you.
So we were chit-chatting a little bit before we started recording, and you brought up this analogy of how the kind of reliant on subsidies and tax credits isn't unique to the United States. And you saw this happen in Italy back in 2008, 2009. Can you share a little bit about that analogy? I had no idea, and it was super insightful to me.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So a lot of markets globally have gone through cycles of, strong support for renewables from the government that was phased out over time. So creating a little bit of a boom and bust cycle. And Italy is an interesting case study. So back in 2008, when I was at SunPower, we had a big development team getting interconnect and land positions in Italy and developing and building large solar plants. And then because of the market overheating, the government cut that program and everybody sort of abandoned the market. So a lot of the development assets, the land and interconnect positions, which intrinsically had a lot of value, were abandoned or sold for pennies on the dollar. But what was interesting at that time is that you could see that solar was actually getting close to being able to compete on an unsubsidized basis. So it was sort of inevitable that a lot of those development positions would become viable in the future. And now if I go back and look at those positions, those have all been built into huge power plants, and the people that bought up the development assets did really well because they were able to build economically viable unsubsidized projects. So, for the U.S. and if I was a developer in the U.S., there could be a buying opportunity now because as the industry continues to drive cost reduction, and as there's a huge demand for power, projects that seem to need the ITC or the IRA to be viable might become viable in a few years' time or 5 years' time. So I think, you may have to take your thinking from a short-term development flip mentality to a longer term. But I think there's still huge opportunity for developers in this country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We have all this land that probably has some level of landowner approval or agreement and maybe an interconnection position, and it's just kind of sitting there right for the taking. So I agree. I think that's an interesting opportunity that we have if we're looking for opportunities out of an unfortunate budget bill.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of the budget bill, you sort of have an unpopular opinion about the IRA. Can you share that very briefly?
Yeah, I mean, ever since I've entered the industry, I've wanted to work in an unsubsidized business because, any industry that relies on the support of the government, that creates a level of instability because, one day it's in favor, one day it's out of favor. And I think looking back at the IRA, which was very well intended as a piece of legislation, I think the incentives afforded to the solar industry were probably higher than were needed to make projects viable, and which created a lot of projects, which is fantastic. And there's been a really impressive amount of build out. But kind of creates an unsustainable situation where it requires a lot of financial support from the government that may not be required, and it builds a perception that solar can only exist without subsidy, and which is negative for the industry because people think of it as sort of the lazy industry living on the government dole, which isn't the case. I mean, in most of the world, solar is competitive without any government support. So I think that a sunsetting of the sort of government support for solar is okay. It would be better to do that smoothly over
Sure.
years as opposed to very abruptly, which was what we're seeing. But I think ultimately the industry is going to regroup because I think that the economics are such that solar with batteries can have reliable, firm, dispatchable power that's economically competitive with natural gas, and is certainly going to be very competitive versus what people are speculating that nuclear can do. So I think the economics are there. It's going to create a lot of disruption. The only thing that I don't like about what's happening currently is that because of the abruptness, I think a lot of the innovation and manufacturing that's been blossoming over the last few years under the IRA, that's going to get severely impacted, which isn't good for sort of the competitiveness of the U.S. economy, right? So we'll see what happens, but I think the industry will reemerge.
Absolutely. Matt, thank you so much for joining me today. I appreciate it.